When you speak of the Genna crime family, you're not talking about ordinary criminals. You're talking about men so twisted, so volatile, they redefined what it meant to rule the streets of Chicago. These were the kind of gangsters who didn't just thrive in chaos, they created it. Welcome to the world of the Gennas, a Sicilian crime family that turned Prohibition-era Chicago into their battleground. Today, we're diving deep into the 5 craziest mobsters from this infamous bloodline, starting with a 3-way tie you won't believe. Mike the Devil Genna, Antonio the Gentleman Genna, and Vincenzo Jim Genna. These brothers were more than just ruthless, they were an unholy trinity of terror. Each had a unique brand of violence that made them legends of Chicago's underworld, but their unpredictable nature and brutal methods also paved the way for their bloody downfall. Buckle up, because what you're about to hear is the stuff of nightmares, or for these brothers, just another day in the life. When the Genna brothers smuggled their way into Chicago's underworld, Mike the Devil. Genna's reign began with fire, an appetite for violence that knew no limits. His brothers, Antonio the Gentleman and Vincenzo Jim, played their parts with equal fervor, though they wore masks of refinement, deceiving those who mistook their quiet ruthlessness for civility. They weren't just mobsters. They were artists of agony, each murder a brushstroke in their macabre masterpiece. In Little Sicily, they were nothing more than farmhands at first, newly arrived in 1906, learning how to bend their backs to the land and keep their mouths shut. But the sweat and toil of honest work couldn't contain the venom in their veins. By night, Mike sharpened his blade, both literally and figuratively, testing the weight of a gun in his hand, imagining the sound of it splitting the silence of the night. His temper was notorious, a fuse that burned too quickly. His brothers followed his lead, each one more sinister than the next. Their rise from laborers to lords of Chicago's West Side was as rapid as it was violent. They tasted their first drop of the miscreant lifestyle in the early 1920s when they discovered the lifeblood of Chicago's underworld bootlegged liquor. Corn sugar was their currency, and the illegal stills they set up in the dilapidated tenements pumped out liquor by the gallon. Their workers, desperate Sicilian immigrants fresh off the boat and barely able to speak English, laboured like ghosts in darkened rooms, the air thick with alcohol fumes and the constant threat of an explosion. One wrong move and a still would erupt in a burst of metal and flame, turning men into mangled bodies, their screams smothered by the sound of cracking bones and shattering glass. The Gennas didn't care. There were always more hands willing to trade their lives for a few dollars and a chance to avoid a debt that would see them buried just as fast. With their distilleries churning and money flowing like the liquor they sold, the Gennas built an empire. They expanded beyond the tenements and saloons, buying mansions far from the stench of the slums where they did their business. Peter opened a grand speakeasy under the guise of a cafe, a place where deals were made and bodies were buried with a wink and a nod. Sam's billiard hall became the gang's nerve center, its smoky back rooms filled with men who knew the value of silence. Their power seemed unstoppable, a shadow stretching over Chicago like a noose tightening around the city's neck. But the tighter the hold, the faster it slips away. Their fall came in 1921, swift and brutal. Angelo Genna, the youngest and most volatile, had been pulling strings behind the scenes in a bloody turf war between Alderman John Powers and his political rival, Anthony DeAndrea. When a brash precinct captain, Paolo Labriola, made the fatal mistake of aligning himself with the wrong side, he sealed his own fate. Labriola was gunned down in broad daylight, cutting the marionette strings and leaving his body slumped in the streets. The police swept through Little Sicily, grabbing Sam Amatuna and Frank Gambino, 2 of the Genna's soldiers, hoping to make an example of the notorious family. But the case, like so many others involving the Gennas, died before it even saw a courtroom. Bribes exchanged hands, and the brothers walked free, their power undiminished, their reputation only growing more fearsome. The streets, though, whispered of revenge. Enemies festered in the shadows, none more deadly than the North Side gang. George Bugs Moran and Vincent Drucci had been watching, waiting, and when Mike Genna crossed paths with them in 1923, the air crackled with impending violence. At the corner of Congress and Morgan Streets, Mike, flanked by Alberto Anselmi and Giovanni Scalisi, squared off against Moran and Drucci. The pavement became a battlefield as gunfire erupted from all sides. Bullets ricocheted off brick and steel, the screech of tires mingling with the screams of panicked civilians. Mike stood firm, a demon with a gun, firing indiscriminately, his eyes wild with the promise of blood. Though he survived the shootout, the battle lines had been drawn. The North Side wouldn't forget, and neither would Mike. Soon after that encounter, the streets of Chicago turned into a war zone. Angelo Genna's violent streak had become a liability, and his enemies were closing in. By 1925, the Gennas had amassed a list of rivals too long to ignore, and the walls around them began to close in. The first crack came when Angelo was arrested for the murder of Nicola Adamo, a man who had foolishly whispered his suspicions to his wife about James Genna. His body turned up riddled with bullets, his limbs twisted grotesquely as if in his last moments he had tried to escape the Reaper himself. The police, as always, were useless. Angelo walked free again, money exchanging hands like secret promises in dark alleys. But power, once gained, is never secure. In 1925, Mike Genna met his end in a hail of bullets, gunned down in an ambush orchestrated by the North Side gang. The blood feud had reached its climax, and Mike, once the most feared man in Little Sicily, lay dying in the street, his body riddled with bullets. His brothers scrambled, desperate to hold on to their crumbling empire, but the damage was done. One by one, the brothers fell. Peter murdered in cold blood, Sam arrested and beaten to death in prison. The summer of 1925 draped the city of Chicago in the kind of oppressive heat that made every shadow seem dangerous, every alley a potential death trap. The city thrummed with tension, thick as the scent of gunpowder in the air. Angelo Genna, once the undisputed enforcer of the Genna family, now found himself at the center of a collapsing empire. An empire built on blood and betrayal, teetering on the edge of oblivion. For years, Angelo had played the streets like a conductor directing an orchestra of violence, his every gesture a command that sent men to their graves. But by May, the Genna family's reign was beginning to crack, and those fissures spread fast, widening with each new betrayal, each whispered deal made in darkened corners. The first crack came in November 1924, when Dean O'Banion, the beloved leader of the North Side gang, was cut down in his flower shop. The murder had the Genna family's fingerprints all over it, and the North Side was out for blood. Men like Bugs Moran, Drucci, and Jaime Weiss didn't take losses lightly. They were biding their time, waiting for their moment to strike, and Angelo, fierce, unrelenting Angelo, was their prime target. The Gennas had overstepped, and the North Side gang's appetite for revenge was insatiable. Allies who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Angelo began to scatter like rats from a sinking ship. Anselmi and Scalise, trusted lieutenants, now defected to Capone, offering their loyalty to the highest bidder. Even Angelo's longtime confidant, Philip Maltese, had slipped away into the shadows, leaving Genna exposed. The once mighty Genna family was no more, their legacy lost to the streets they once ruled. All that remained were the whispers of a reign that had crumbled under the weight of its own violence, buried in the rubble of Chicago's brutal underworld. Joe Aiello didn't just play with fire, he danced in the flames, daring anyone, especially Al Capone, to extinguish him. A man with ambition as lethal as his enemies, Aiello sought to claim Chicago's underworld throne, and the result was nothing short of carnage. His final days were spent in paranoia, hunted like a rabid dog, until one day fate and 59 bullets caught up to him. His assassination wasn't just a hit, it was a brutal symphony of vengeance, where every gunshot played a note of his downfall. Enjoy the melody as we unravel the chilling demise of a man who gambled with the devil and lost. Giuseppe Joe Aiello had always craved power, not just the fleeting authority that came with money or influence, but the unshakable fear of those who dared to utter his name. It was the kind of power that made enemies tread lightly and allies bend willingly. Born in the rugged hills of Bagheria, Sicily, where poverty was the only certainty, Aiello had witnessed his mother's funeral before he could even speak. Her death carved an emptiness in him, an insatiable hunger that followed him when he boarded the ship to America at 17. But in Chicago, it wasn't food he wanted, it was control. By 1925, Aiello had carved out a niche for himself in Chicago's underworld. The Aiello brothers' bakery was the front, but the real money flowed from bootleg liquor and sugar, feeding the city's thirst for illegal booze during Prohibition. As his power grew, so did his ambition. The moment he severed ties with his former business partner, Antonio Lombardo, a key ally of Al Capone, Aiello set into motion a violent rivalry that would become one of the bloodiest in the city's history. But it wasn't enough to simply cut ties. Aiello had to erase the man. And behind Lombardo stood Capone, a force that even Aiello, brimming with confidence, knew he couldn't ignore. In the spring of 1927, Aiello, filled with resentment for Lombardo's control of the Unione Siciliana, began plotting. He moved cautiously at first, biding his time, setting up business deals as if nothing had changed, while whispering in the right ears about Lombardo's weaknesses. His first assassination attempt was simple. A hired cook at Capone's favorite restaurant, Bella Napoli Cafe. The chef was to lace Lombardo's soup with poison, ensuring his death would seem as natural as a sudden illness. But Capone, ever watchful, had an eye everywhere. The chef turned on Aiello, and the plan unraveled like a poorly sewn seam. Capone's men descended on Aiello's bakery one balmy May evening. Without warning, the rat-a-tat-tat of machine guns echoed through the streets as the windows shattered, sending shards of glass across the bakery floor. Over 200 bullets were fired, each one a promise that Capone wasn't just coming for Lombardo's enemies, he was making an example. Aiello's brother Antonio barely escaped with his life, but the message was clear. As Aiello's obsession with eliminating both Capone and Lombardo intensified, he was no longer content with whispers and underhanded schemes. This time he offered an open bounty, $50,000 for Capone's head. He became a man driven by paranoia, hiding in plain sight, plotting from the shadows. His hideouts changed weekly. First, it was a speakeasy in Trenton, then a safe house in Buffalo, always keeping just one step ahead of Capone's reach. Hitmen from New York, Milwaukee, and even Wisconsin answered his call, but each one found themselves silenced before they could even pull the trigger. One by one, Capone's men got to them, leaving bodies in alleys, in warehouses, in trunks of cars, each dead hitman a reminder of Capone's far-reaching grasp. But Aiello's most devastating blow would come from his own attempt to force the Chicago streets into war. He teamed up with Frank Yale, a powerful mobster from New York, an alliance that Aiello believed could tip the scales. But as fate would have it, Capone struck first. Yale was gunned down on the streets of Brooklyn, his body riddled with bullets in broad daylight. He had become a man betrayed by his own desperation, his power slipping through his fingers. Yet, in the summer of 1928, Aiello found his last hope, his most dangerous move. He joined forces with Bugs Moran, whose hatred for Capone ran as deep as his own. They conspired to kill Lombardo, and Aiello finally tasted victory. On a September day, Lombardo was ambushed and gunned down in the streets, his body crumpling on the pavement like a discarded puppet. For a fleeting moment, Aiello tasted power again. His enemies were dead, and the Unione Siciliana was within reach. But the triumph was hollow, for every step forward felt like treading deeper into quicksand. He knew Capone was watching, waiting. His fall came with brutal finality on October 23, 1930. Aiello, now hunted and paranoid, was hiding in an apartment building on Chicago's west side, a temporary refuge he thought would be safe. But Capone's reach extended even here. As Aiello stepped out of the building, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs, Capone's gunmen were waiting. The crack of gunfire was deafening, and Aiello's body jolted as bullets tore into him, 59 in total. He collapsed onto the sidewalk, his blood pooling around him like dark wine, his ambitions dying with him. The Chicago Tribune would call Aiello the toughest gangster in Chicago, but in the end, his thirst for power, his obsession with revenge, had led him into the mouth of death itself. His rise had been bloody, his fall swift, and the streets of Chicago would never forget the war he had waged. Yet in the shadow of Capone's reign, Aiello's story was one of inevitable defeat, a man who sought to conquer a kingdom that was already built on bones.
They say God forgives, but the Mafia never forgets. Anthony D'Andrea, a man of the cloth-turned-mob boss, walked a line few dared to tread. From the pulpit to the dark underbelly of Chicago's Mafia, D'Andrea clawed his way to the top, using charm, violence, and political sway to control the city's most dangerous ward. But in the streets soaked in vendettas, no amount of prayers could save him. The hit came fast, the bullets ripping through flesh and bone, leaving D'Andrea crumpled in a doorway, blood pouring into the cracks of Chicago's gritty pavement. Let's crusade into the life of corruption, betrayal, and cold-blooded murder that marked the rise and violent fall of the most unlikely mafia kingpin in Chicago's history. Anthony D'Andrea stepped onto American soil with the ambitions of a scholar, but would soon cloak himself in shadows that stretched far beyond the noble halls of learning. Born in the old Sicilian town of Valedolmo, where vendettas simmered beneath the surface of everyday life, D'Andrea brought with him the indelible stamp of a world where the mafia was as constant as the church bells. Educated in law and ordained as a priest, his early life hinted at the pursuit of virtue. But by the time he arrived in Chicago in 1899, it became clear that D'Andrea was a man at war with the darker impulses seeping through his soul. His first sensation of sin began in the quiet pews of St. Anthony's, where D'Andrea was appointed pastor, his robes immaculate, his sermons gilded with eloquence. But behind the pious veneer, an insidious transformation was underway. It started with whispers, deals struck in confessional booths, alliances formed under the guise of spiritual guidance. He had left Sicily behind, but its code had followed him, woven into the very fibers of his being. Soon, the priest's cassock became a suffocating reminder of vows that no longer suited him, and when he met Lena Wagner, a young German woman, the tension within him snapped. He abandoned the priesthood, abandoning holiness for a woman who would be both his salvation and his ruin. Their love was no sanctuary. Soon after they wed, Lena disappeared without a trace. Panic gripped D'Andrea's heart like a vice, and in the seedy underbelly of Chicago, he tore apart the city to find her. Dark suspicions gnawed at him. Were her caretakers hiding her? Had she been taken? The search was ruthless, as police, bought or coerced, rattled cages on his behalf. When the reunion finally came, it was a bitter victory, marred by the weight of secrets too dangerous to forget. That was the catalyst creating his first fall, which arrived when D'Andrea's lawful pursuits crumbled, replaced by something far more nefarious. Chicago in the early 1900s was a city of steam and blood, a burgeoning metropolis riddled with crime, its streets echoing with the menace of the Black Hand. For a man like D'Andrea, whose charm was as sharp as his ambition, it was the perfect landscape. The life of a priest faded like a dream, and the life of a mafioso began in earnest. D'Andrea, leveraging his education, soon became indispensable, a translator and legal advisor to the wave of Italian immigrants. His connections within the mafia deepened as he wrapped himself tighter in the world of counterfeit schemes and racketeering. In 1902, his reign of crime was briefly halted when he was arrested for leading a counterfeiting ring. The arrest was his first brush with the law. Shackled in a cell, his mind raced, not with fear, but with fury. How had he allowed himself to be caught? Convicted and sentenced to Joliet State Prison, the walls closed in, but D'Andrea's iron will remained unbroken. From the confines of prison, he wove a campaign for his release, bending sympathizers to his will. The letters flowed to the federal government until, 13 months later, D'Andrea emerged from the shadows of his cell, a man reborn in ambition but darker in spirit. The priest was long gone. Now, a different D'Andrea walked the streets, a man unafraid to wield both pen and pistol in his pursuit of power. Chicago's bloody streets were a chessboard, and D'Andrea was playing to win. His partnerships were calculated, and in 1911, he co-owned a business with Martin Merlo, brother to the fearsome Mike Merlo. It was here that his power deepened, his influence spreading through the labor unions like poison through the veins. When Joseph D'Andrea, no relation, was gunned down in the streets, an assassination cloaked in the niceties of a handshake, it was Anthony who stepped into the vacuum of power, becoming president of the local 286 of the International Hod Carriers Union. His enemies knew him now, feared him, but D'Andrea was always several steps ahead. But his inevitable fall came as he pursued his ambitions in politics, seeking alderman in the violent, infamous 19th Ward. This was no ordinary campaign. Here, blood and ballots were interchangeable, and D'Andrea's criminal past became a noose tightening around his neck. Bombs exploded in the night, rivals met untimely ends, and the streets ran red. The newspapers seized on the carnage, exposing D'Andrea's past crimes, driving him to abandon his ambitions. But the damage was already done. He had tasted power, and its allure was too potent to resist. His final ascent occurred in 1919, when D'Andrea ascended to the presidency of the Unione Siciliana, a title that came with the weight of both respect and fear. The organization, which had once been a beacon of support for poor Sicilian immigrants, now became the core of his mafia operations. As president, D'Andrea cemented his status as a boss of bosses, a man feared even among criminals. He returned to politics, this time as ward committeeman, another rung on his ladder to power. But every rise brings with it a reckoning. His ultimate demise was as swift as it was brutal. The Alderman's War, his attempt to wrest control from his longtime rival John Powers, was the culmination of years of bitter feuds. The violence that had simmered below the surface now exploded in a flurry of assassinations, bombings, and betrayals. It was a war neither side could win without paying the highest price. On a dark May night in 1921, as D'Andrea stepped into his apartment, the assassin struck. The bullet tore through the night, shattering the world D'Andrea had so meticulously built. He fell, blood soaking the floor, his empire crumbling around him. The next day, he lay in a hospital bed, life ebbing away. By morning, Anthony D'Andrea was dead. His reign, like so many before him, had ended in violence and betrayal. The Mafia moved on without him, and Mike Merlo, who had been in Italy during the assassination, wasted no time ordering revenge for his fallen ally. Yet, as the years passed, D'Andrea's story became just another chapter in Chicago's bloody history, a tale of a priest who had become a prince of crime, and whose ambition, in the end, led only to the grave.
In the shadowy alleys of Prohibition-era Chicago, Samuzzo Amatuna believed his diamond-studded confidence and ruthless reputation made him invincible. But when you swim with sharks long enough, you eventually bleed. Amatuna's downfall wasn't a blaze of glory, but a brutal, calculated execution, gunned down mid-shave in a barbershop where he thought he was safe. Let's peel back the layers of this chilling assassination, where betrayal, blood and bullets painted the final chapter of one of the Windy City's deadliest mobsters. Salvatore Samuzzo Amatuna's life, like many in Chicago's underworld, began on a path paved with ambition and drenched in blood. Born in Pozzallo, Sicily in 1898, he was a product of both his heritage and the brutal streets of Little Italy, where boys grew up with guns in their hands and death in their shadows. By the time he was 17, Amatuna had already committed his first murder, a favor for the Genna brothers, an upstart gang bent on controlling Chicago's political landscape through fear and violence. Amatuna shot Frank Lombardi outside a saloon in cold blood, a hit designed to tilt the scales of power in the infamous Alderman's Wars. But that was just the beginning of his bloody journey. Prohibition opened the floodgates of opportunity, and Amatuna, already a rising star in the Genna Empire, found himself at the heart of their bootlegging operation. By the early 1920s, his role had evolved from mere enforcer to overseeing the vast network of alky cookers, churning out the lifeblood of Chicago's black market illegal alcohol. He was Angelo Genna's right-hand man, a position of power and prestige, but also one that put a target squarely on his back. In a world ruled by bombings and drive-bys, Amatuna stood out. He was the epitome of a gangster dandy, strutting through Chicago's elite establishments with his trademark diamond studs and cufflinks, flashing wealth, confidence, and an ever-growing arrogance. This wasn't just bravado. Amatuna believed himself untouchable, even claiming that no one would dare shoot him in his beloved Bluebird Cafe, a hub where friends and allies gathered and enemies stayed far away. But arrogance, in this dangerous game, was often a death sentence. The war between the Genna brothers and the North Side gang escalated into a maelstrom of violence. By 1925, the Gennas were losing ground, and Amatuna, left to pick up the pieces after Angelo Genna's assassination, found himself increasingly isolated. The tension in the streets was palpable, and yet Amatuna carried on, assuming control of the Genna Empire and making a bold move, declaring himself president of the Unione Siciliana, a position coveted by none other than Al Capone. It was a challenge Capone could not ignore. On the night of November 10th, 1925, as Amatuna prepared for an evening at the opera, his fate was sealed in a barber's chair. As the hot towel draped across his face, the world outside the barbershop moved on as usual. But inside, the air was thick with impending doom. When two gunmen burst into the shop, guns drawn, the peaceful hum of daily life turned into chaos. Amatuna, quick as ever, ducked behind the chair, but the bullets found him. The barber's screams echoed as his lifeblood spilled onto the floor. 2 shots to the chest, a hit meant to silence him forever. At the hospital, clinging to life, Amatuna made one last request. He wanted to marry his lover, Rose Pecorara, a final act of defiance against the life that had betrayed him. but the ceremony would never be completed. Death came for Samoots in the early hours of November 13th, just as it had come for Angelo Genna, Labriola, and countless others before him. The streets whispered the names of his killers, Northside hitmen Vincent Drucci and Jim Doherty, but no justice would come. The violence continued, claiming Amatuna's bodyguards in swift succession, as if to erase every trace of the man who once boasted invincibility. When it comes to Chicago's bloody Prohibition era, few names strike fear like Bloody Angelo Genna. Born in the heart of Sicily and raised in the brutal streets of Chicago's Little Italy, Genna's rise to power was marked by ruthless ambition and a trail of bodies. His life was a high-speed chase through the underworld, one that ended with bullets, shattered glass, and a lamppost wrapped in twisted metal. Today, we're diving into the story of a man who ignited a war with Chicago's most dangerous gangsters and paid the ultimate price in a hail of gunfire. The dawn of Prohibition gave rise to a seething underworld where men like Bloody Angelo Genna carved their empire in blood. Born in the cobbled streets of Marsala, Sicily, and tempered by the fierce poverty of Chicago's Little Italy, Angelo was no stranger to violence. By the time he and his 6 brothers entered the grim ranks of the Sicilian Mafia in Chicago, Angelo had learned that survival was more than cunning. It required cruelty. The city was a battlefield, and Angelo was prepared to stain its streets red. In the shadows of 1921's Alderman's Wars, Genna tasted his first major kill. The city reeked of tension, as powerful men like Anthony DeAndrea hired hitmen to secure political dominance in Chicago's 19th Ward. Angelo was just such a man. Sent to deal with supporters of rival Alderman John Powers, Genna found his mark, Harry Raimondi, in the dim back room of a smoke-filled bar. The flash of gunfire tore through the haze, scattering chairs and sending panicked patrons scrambling for cover. Raimondi fell to the floor, his blood mingling with the spilled liquor, his gasps for breath barely audible above the din of shouts and shattering glass. Genna slipped into the night, another ghost of Chicago's relentless war. But the thrill of his escape was short-lived. Powers' men struck back, hunting Angelo with a relentless fury. He was arrested for Raimondi's murder, and the courtroom became a theatre of treachery and deceit. His defense attorney, a close ally of D'Andrea, spun a web of lies that unraveled the prosecution's case, and the jury was left grasping at shadows. Angelo walked free, but the spectre of vengeance always lurked nearby, whispering in the dark corners of his mind. By 1924, Angelo had grown in power, fueled by the unlawful profits of Prohibition. The Genna family had perfected the art of bootlegging, crafting a liquor empire from the very law that sought to dismantle it. But their success drew enemies, none fiercer than Dean O'Banion, leader of the North Side gang. Their rivalry simmered with the heat of territorial greed, bubbling over the moment O'Banion crossed the line. It was an innocuous dispute over a gambling debt at the Ship, a casino where men like Al Capone and Frank Nitti tallied their illicit earnings. O'Banion demanded Angelo pay the marker, and with that insult sealed his fate. The Gennas, under the blessing of the South Side's Johnny Torrio, plotted O'Banion's death with the precision of a clockmaker. The hit was artfully crafted, a cruel symphony of betrayal. On a crisp November morning, Angelo's men strolled into O'Banion's flower shop, Schofield, under the guise of friendly customers. A handshake sealed the pact, and the blast of gunfire followed. O'Banion collapsed in a heap of blood and blooms, his body riddled with bullets, his defiant sneer frozen in death. The flowers he had arranged were soaked crimson, their fragrance mingling with the metallic tang of spilled life. Yet, even as the Gennas celebrated, the storm they had unleashed darkened the sky. With O'Banion's death, Chicago's underworld was plunged into a violent upheaval. The North Side gang, now under the ruthless command of Jaime Weiss, sought vengeance, blood for blood. The Gennas, once the hunters, found themselves in the crosshairs. Angelo's life became a game of survival. The streets of Chicago, once the playground of his ambition, now twisted into a labyrinth of death traps. On May 26, 1925, fate caught up with him. George Bugs Moran, the North Side's cold-blooded killer, had Angelo in his sights. A high-speed chase ensued, the roar of engines echoing through the city's narrow streets. Angelo, gripping the steering wheel of his Cadillac, felt the cold hand of destiny tightening around his throat. Bullets whizzed past his head, shattering windows, tearing through metal. Sweat dripped down his brow, and his pulse hammered in his ears. He swerved wildly, dodging pedestrians and crashing through fruit stands, but Moran was relentless. A sharp turn, a scream of tires on asphalt, and then the shot. The impact was instantaneous, a white-hot pain searing through Angelo's chest. His car veered off course, slamming into a lamppost with a deafening crash. Smoke billowed from the wreckage as Angelo gasped for air, each breath a labor, each second stretching into eternity. Blood poured from his wounds, pooling in his lap as he struggled to keep his fading vision focused on the street ahead. When the police arrived, the words they sought were left unsaid. Angelo's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. Asked to name his attackers, he merely shrugged, his silence as deadly as the bullets that felled him. And with that final gesture, Bloody Angelo Genna slipped into the abyss. His reign of terror had come to a bloody, violent end. The aftermath of Angelo's death was as grand as his life had been vicious. His funeral, designed to rival O'Banion's, boasted a parade of Chicago's elite. The scent of lilies, peonies and carnations filled the air, sent by the very men who had orchestrated the carnage that tore the city apart. But beneath the pageantry, the war raged on. Angelo's brothers would soon follow him to the grave, victims of the same game they had so ruthlessly played. The cycle of violence spun ever faster, and the empire Angelo had built on blood and fear crumbled into dust. Chicago had no use for sentimentality. The funeral, with its 3,000 guests, its grand bronze coffin, was nothing more than a fleeting spectacle. The Gennas were a fading chapter in a book that would never close, just another bloody page in the history of a city that fed on violence. As Angelo was laid to rest in Mount Carmel Cemetery, the soil above his grave settled, and the world moved on. In the end, Chicago would remember Angelo not for his wealth or power, but for the trail of bodies he left behind. A dark figure lost to the shadows of history, where crime and vengeance are eternal bedfellows.